we've loaded this webinar with so many additional resources that the people on the line today can repurpose and reuse, and hopefully help them to make some sense of this and to do it in a way that benefits their RTO.
Look, that makes great sense to me, Mark. So please take us away, and as you get a chance, please start those slides. And everybody, I hope you enjoy the webinar today. Mark's asking there's a slide coming up. Hands up if you can hear me. So please pop your hands up. I see a bunch of hands.
We'd be remiss not to check. We'd be remiss not to check, Damien. So we'll kick on from there. It looks like that everybody can hear us loud and clear, which is awesome. If you do have any troubles as we go through, feel free to pop that into the chat window, and Damien will double back around and help you with any of those challenges as we go through. As my producer today, great to have you on the line, and great to have you with me today too, Damien. So for those that were with us earlier, you will have seen this pre-session word search, and listen, we had an awesome bunch of folks joining us earlier. They got them all, but just for those playing at home on the recording, these were all the answers that we came up with there, folks. And these are all terms that we're going to be talking a little bit about today, and they all relate to validation activities. Now, if you liked what you saw and you want to make one of these for yourself, you can check out puzzlemaker.discoveryeducation.com. So it's an extra bit of a bonus resource for attending our webinar today. Now let me spend a little bit of time providing an overview for where we're going on this journey around validating training and assessment. We'll talk about what validation is first. Then we'll have a look at what the regulator has to say. Now, please be assured that when I say the regulator, I mean all the relevant regulators to do with VET in Australia. So we do have ASQA, the national regulator, but we also have the West Australian regulator and the Victorian regulator. They all do sing from the same songbook, and they do refer their guidance, if you like, and their judgments to the standards for RTOs 2015. So as I said, when I talk about regulator, depending on what state you're in, that's the regulator that I'm talking about. We'll move on to talk about some of those present challenges, and I'll be inviting you to share some additional ones through the chat windows. That's a little bit of a signpost for us down the track. If there are some specific challenges that you're having with validation, please let us know, and hopefully we can give you some great advice. If nothing else, I do have that support material that should put you on that righteous path. Before we finish up the webinar, though, I do want to give you the characteristics of a systematic validation system. We'll learn today about the importance of that systematic approach, and I've got 5 steps to really getting this right. Towards the end, we will talk about some technology to support this effort, and I'll share, I think there's about 6 or 7 things to look at, all that have free options as well, and hopefully there's something in that for everybody today. And then at the end, we'll provide some of the popular approaches, and I'll talk through those templates that are in the resources box today. So I do want to lead it out with a poll before we move into the content, and this is the first question I want to ask. How would you rate your validation processes now? Are you attending this more for affirmation, or are you looking to get an idea to get you back on track? Are you awesome? You should write a book on the topic. Are you very good? Are you okay? Maybe struggling? Or what's validation again? Feel free to choose one of those options now.
Mark, I see the votes are starting to come in already.
Yeah, lots of votes coming through, so we'll close that in just a moment. There's a few people coming in a little bit late too, so you might want to mute them as they go through, but welcome those folks that have just jumped on the line as well. We've only just started.
Okay, Mark, we've almost got everybody's votes, so I'm just going to close this poll and share the results. Any last takers to jump in?
No more bets.
Here we go. No more bets. You're a casino man, Mark, aren't you?
Well, I do have a risk-taking part in me, I guess, yeah. But in a good way, in a good way. So listen, the lion's share of our attendees today are saying, listen, it's okay, but it could be better, which makes some sense why you want to join us today. Although we do have 26 and 11% respectively that are really looking at this webinar as affirmation. So they think, you know what, I'm pretty good at this, but there's always more spaces to go, there's always more to learn. And as I said, that affirmation process is good. So for a webinar like this, it's good to sort of say, well, how do our current systems relate to what the expectations are and what the best practices are? And then for those that perhaps haven't done a lot of this, you might be looking for a framework to get you started. It's going to benefit benefit both sets of groups today. We do have a few people at the bottom end there looking at, I'd like to get us forward and so forth, but yeah, some definitely some places for us to improve as we move along there. So we'll jump back into the slides, Damien, if we could. And ultimately here, I wanted to provide a bit of a metaphor, if you like, for what's happening next in our journey today. And I'm going to share a whole host of ideas and advice and templates and really things to consider post-training today. And for me, it's a bit like that sort of that candy stand that's outside a cinema. There's all those different choices. In the end, you've got to pick the candies that you like and put them in the bag, and they're the ones you're going to crunch on. And hopefully, you'll find something sweet that'll really amplify and make the experience better for you, your organisation, and of course your candidates. So that's kind of the metaphor I want us to look at. Bit of a smorgasbord or a lolly smorgasbord. Put on your plate what you think is going to work best for you, and I think that's the best way to look at our webinar today. So our first agenda item was, what is validation? You know, and just to put this in perspective, validation is a quality review process which confirms that your RTO's assessment system can consistently produce valid assessment judgments. That's a very important part of this. And when we think about validation, for those that have been doing this a while, we'll be very familiar with the idea of the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. And we know that there's validity in both of those. And in really simple terms, what we're saying there is that, are we asking the right questions? So are they valid questions, or are we setting valid tasks for our participants to complete? And then, are we getting valid evidence? So is the evidence we're getting consistent with the requirements? But listen, there is a third string to that bow, which is, are we then taking those valid questions with the quality evidence we get and making the right decisions? Okay, and that's why we need to validate the judgments and not just the tools that we choose to use. So a valid assessment judgment is one that confirms that the learner has all the knowledge and skills described in the relevant training product. And again, if I can clarify, when I talk about a training product, it's basically whatever you have on your scope of registration. So if you have an accredited course on your scope of registration, that's what I'm talking about as a training product. If you have a qualification, that could be the training product. It could be a skill set, or you might have a standalone unit. In that particular case, that's also a training product. So it will differ depending on who you are, the size of your RTO, but they're all versions of training products. The other key thing about validation is that the activities are generally conducted after the assessment is complete, so we can see the full picture of what's happened. We see the tools, we see the guidance that we've given our assessors to make decisions, we've got the evidence, and in the end we have those final judgments. So can we check that all of those practices and judgments are consistent with the requirements? In terms of the standards for RTOs, it's very clear about what we have to do in terms of validation. And I wanted to share that with us now, so we had that kind of on track and in the back of our minds as we move through some of the material today. So according to clauses 1.9, 1.10 and 1.11, for those playing at home, validation is a critical requirement for RTOs to maintain their registration. And interestingly enough, folks, even if you're applying to become an RTO for the very first time, you have to have a really good idea of future casting how your strategy for validation is going to go. So even though you don't have anything historical to share, it's going to be very important for you to say, well, these are the systems we'll put in place to capture this and then make the quality decisions that we need. So yes, it's definitely important for maintaining a registration, but that strategy is important for starting one as well. So it specifically says these things in terms of what we need as an RTO. We have to have a plan for that ongoing systematic validation over a 5-year cycle. Now that 5 years comes from a historical situation in RTO land where registration periods used to be 5 years in the main. We now know that some jurisdictions, including with ASQA, some RTOs are actually given 7 years. So at our last re-registration, we got 7 years. Some are 5, some are even shorter than that, depending on the risk level of that RTO. But that's kind of where that 5 years has come from, if you ever wondered why it was 5 years. Now, the challenge with this for us as RTOs invariably is, where is the life of the qualification in that 5 years? It's very likely that many of those qualifications will become superseded within that time. And I get the question quite a lot, which is, well, do I have to do it for that one if it's going to be superseded? Shouldn't I do the next one? Listen, my advice to you here is that you should always be validating every product you've got on scope, okay? And it makes a lot of sense to do that before you transition, so you can really map the differences between the superseded one and the new one that's coming. So most of you would be doing that kind of process anyway, but it really makes sure you've got your ducks in a row before you go forth on that next stage. And in many cases, the regulator is going to want to see that evidence that it was validated prior to submitting the new additions to scope. And this is particularly true for those of us on the line that are applying to add the TAE to scope, or the new TAE qualifications to scope. The other important point for us to consider today is that validation should be undertaken by qualified people who are not directly involved with the particular instance being validated. And this becomes a challenge for smaller RTOs where they may have staff that are pretty much involved with everything, which is why in those cases they might need to turn towards external validators, or think of how they schedule their training and assessment activities and see if you can be using different trainers for different sets, and therefore you're able to use them for validation in different places because they're not directly related to the particular instance being validated. So what other qualifications do they need? I want to be very clear about this, and this comes from the how-to guide or the fact sheet from ASQA. They need to have vocational competence. So they need to know what it is that they're looking at. So they need to have that vocational competence in the subject area. They also need to have current industry skills, which makes a lot of sense. Do they know what the current expectations of the job are? Are they able to be up to date with the latest terminology and the legislation and so forth? That way they can look at the assessments and the judgments to really see whether they reflect that current practice. And they also need to have knowledge and skill in vocational teaching and learning. So this particular webinar is talking about validating training and assessment. That's when they step back and say, have we empowered our participants, our candidates, with the right stuff to be able to be assessed in the first place? So that's kind of why those three things are critical qualifications according to the Standards for RTOs How-To Guide. They also need either the TAE, the full certificate for, or the assessor skill set. So again, these are the things that we need to make sure those validators have when they move forward. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be held by a single person. It could be a group or a collective, collectively held. But in the end, you need to make sure that all four of those things are held by that particular group or individual if it's just one person. So I've been talking a little bit at this stage, folks, to really give you my helicopter view. My next question to you is this. Who could you use if you were thinking about external validations? We've been talking a little bit about internal validations, but who might be someone or groups of people that might be relevant for us to bring on board onto that panel, that validation panel? Who could be used as an external validator? Please feel free to use the chat window to pop your best ideas in.
Mark, can I ask you a question as we move into there? It's one that just popped in my head. With respect to external validator, I can understand we need a formal external validator from time to time, but if we've got some people coming in on an external validation panel to assist us in our review of our products, do all of those people participating in those panels need to have all those requirements you listed for us on the previous slide?
No, Damien, it's collectively. So you might have, as somebody's put in the chat window, you might have a subject matter expert, you might have an industry host or an employer representative who really has the great vocational competency and current practice, but they don't have TAE. So they can participate on that panel, but you do also need people there to have guidance around what our sector is and so forth, because that's the downside. They know their stuff, but they may not be familiar with the training package or the requirements for robust assessment, let's say. But they can definitely say, no, that is not representative of the kind of activities or work that we would expect from somebody. So that's the value of their participation. But yeah, we still need to have a group of people that have the big picture collectively. Does that kind of make sense, Damien?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much, Mark. I can see we've got a stack of responses. Do you want to have a little look?
There's some great responses. I did mention some already, but yeah, industry hosts, the subject matter experts are great. Industry auditors, and there's lots of them out there now. There's a lot of people like ourselves, Damien, that they get to a particular point in their organisation and say, you know what, I could do this for other organisations too, and they've got all the systems and so forth. And listen, that stuff's gold. So there's lots of them out there, and listen, there's plenty of people out there willing to do stuff in kind as well. So it doesn't always have to cost a lot of money. There is the cost of time, of course, but definitely there are people out there that want to work things out. And Liz has finished up with industry groups. Again, a great place to get access to people who really know those current expectations, because listen, more and more it's going to be important for us to show that what we do faithfully represents the expectations of the workplace and what's happening in a changing industry situation. So some really great ideas there. Alice has added there other stakeholders may be affected by the training in the training package too. So bringing as many stakeholders, or I prefer to call them shareholders, as many of those people as you can to be involved is going to be super awesome. So listen, I think you got all the main ones that I was going to share, but just to reinforce what we were talking about, I think we can use employers, particularly if you've got a good relationship with them and you're already going to see them. You might have traineeships and so forth, so you're going to see them anyway. Let's get their input about what they're seeing and how that could be modified and changed to benefit them and their staff. You might talk to employer associations, maybe other industry bodies could be used. There might be communities of practice out there. So a lot of industries will have communities of practice where they get lots of like-minded people together to share strategies, ideas, templates, and so forth. So, if your industry doesn't have one, maybe you could be a champion for that, and that's always a good thing to be doing. And listen, I do think it's almost a pay-it-forward type approach there. You're doing good, and that'll come back in kind down the track. Of course, we can use trainers and assessors, and listen, some of the larger public providers, the TAFEs in this case, have a good opportunity at times because they've got sessional trainers. So they might come in, a couple of nights a week, but they're also embedded in industry, so they can actually be really great representatives to help us out, which is great. A bit of noise in the background there, Damien. I think somebody's come back in again. You might want to quickly mute that if you could. And then finally on this list team is consultants, and we said auditors and other people out there that have got some experience. So in this particular case, folks, there's really a lot of places you can go, and it's just a matter of thinking about what's going to be the right fit for your organisation. Now, I did want to provide, I guess, some key advice around what to do when we're developing this validation plan, and this very much is what the regulator is saying in their fact sheets and so forth. So the critical part for us here is that each training product on our scope of registration must undergo that validation at least once every 5 years, okay, at least once every 5 years. You must also ensure that the plan allows for validation of 50% of those training products in the first 3 years of that cycle. Now, for an organisation such as ourselves, we've only got 4 qualifications plus a standalone unit. That's reasonably easy for us to program. I talked to some of the TAFE providers, and they've got hundreds of qualifications. Now, that's quite the plan to put together. And then even some of the private RTOs, they'll have dozens of quals. So the advice I want to talk to you about here is around just how much validation needs to be done, and listen, there's been some clear guidance from the regulator on this. It's okay to do a sampling of units. So you might have 10 units in your qualification. You might grab 2 at a time over that first 3 years, and then you roll out the full 10 over the 3 years. So you don't have to do it all at the same time. You can certainly measure it over a longer period of time. And this is what the regulator will do themselves. If they come in for a site audit, they might sample 2 units, and then if everything stacks up there, they're not going to ask for the rest at that particular juncture. Of course, if there's rectification required in those, they might ask to look a little closer at some of the other units, or next time they come in to check, they might ask for 2 different units to make sure that any of the advice that they've provided to you the first time has been kind of extended to the other parts of your program. Now, it is a mammoth undertaking, you know, and I can't stop that. Later in the webinar, I'll give you some technology ideas that to fast track things, but in the end, the devil's in the detail and getting the schedule right. Again, I will give you a copy of a schedule that I'm hoping will help to put you on that righteous path, as I mentioned earlier. Now, even though I've said that it has to be at least once, you may have to do it more frequently given the risk of the course or qualification that you're delivering. So this risk could be literal risk. You might be doing things where people could die if you get it wrong. So those sort of things need to be validated more frequently to make sure we're not putting people at physical risk. But there's other risks too, you know, things like the TAE. There's no secret that the regulator is making sure that they are checking checking all the applications quite thoroughly, looking at all of those complexities. There's more rigor on it than there's ever been, and that's because they want to make sure that the people who end up with those qualifications can really do the job at the level that they expect. And they see it as a high-risk qualification because it underpins not only the work we do in the industry, but the confidence of consumers as well. So that's an example of a risk. You know, I'd be expecting if you're a TAE provider, you'd be doing it much more than once every 5 years. But there is help at hand here. I do have an example, and you've got a copy of this that comes in your pack, or at least you get a blank copy of this. I'm showing you an example today that will have some of the fields populated, but in this particular example, and you're free to use it too, by the way, even though we've created it, I'm very happy for you to use it. Okay, that's that pay it forward from our perspective too. This is our validation schedule. On the very first page, we talk about what validation is. So anyone that's involved with it has a very clear idea about what those expectations are, and it's linked back to the Standards for RTOs 2015. And then we talk about the requirements of the personnel, which we outlined earlier as well. So we talk about what those qualifications are that people would need to hold. And then underneath that, and it should pop up on your screen in just a sec, I've color-coded the qualifications on our scope. Admittedly, as I said before, you might have lots of qualifications. And what you might want to do there is have your schedule broken down by faculty or by core area. So if you might have business studies and you might have 2 dozen quals there, you might have community services and you've got a dozen quals there. Rather than all on a single sheet, you might break it down in that way, and that might be a way for this to work. And if you're a big color coding geek like me, then there's enough colors to do that if you break it down by that. So Damien's just prompted me there. There's a quick question from Penny. So I'll just quickly jump to that before I share some of this other information. So listen, the question there is that, is it 5 years from the date of your re-registration or from the life of the training product? Listen, Penny, my understanding here is that the timeline starts from that registration period or when it came in. So it sort of came in 2000, this requirement came in 2010. Sorry, 2015, sorry, 2015. So our timeline starts from there. But if you were sort of re-registered in say 2012, potentially you might take it from there. But yeah, ultimately you should have already been doing this prior to that. So for me, it's from when it starts. But if you're a new provider, let's say, then it's going to start from that particular registration period. So as we move on to the other parts of this schedule, I'll just sort of talk you through some of the things that you'll see. And this is only what we've done, okay? I just wanted to share something that might work for the rest of you as well. I've got some clear dates for what we hope to do. And how this literally happens there is we fill out most of this and then we fill out the last 2 columns after it happens. So ultimately there we've got the date, we've got what the product is. You can see here there that we had our sort of re-registration back in 2015, and in this case it was the ASQA risk team that were looking at our stuff and to see whether or not it was acceptable for re-registration, which ultimately they found it to be. And then following that, we start to break down our validation by training product. And we've done things like pilot programs, we've used external consultants. In this case, you'll see on the screen there that we've got John Dwyer from VELG that we've used. Then we've used other RTOs, we've used some internal people. So ultimately there we were saying this is our plan for validation over these particular periods, and then we finish up with what actions need to be taken and who's responsible for those particular actions there. And as you move through those particular examples, you'll notice there that all the color coding kind of works. This makes it super easy for us to see what's been done and what hasn't been done, and that's what I like about this particular situation, folks. So as I said, you have a copy of that in the courseware. You don't have all my examples, but you're able to populate that with your own information, and we've found it really beneficial not only to have transparency about those things well in advance, it helps us to identify when are the most likely points that we can capture this. So we aren't sort of competing operationally with high peak periods in our business, and you'll be in the same boat as that. Now, I often get the question about industry engagement and whether or not you can capture that in the same place, and my answers are yes. I think you can combine both of those things on a similar document. You might want to add an extra column there that talks about what you learned from that engagement, but ultimately if you're looking for fast tracking things and making a job easier for someone who has to capture both pieces of information and having that transparency too about what you need to do, I think is good to put those two things on there. So another quick question for the chat box team is who should also consider, who should also consider whether the assessment tools, we should. You should also consider whether the assessment, it's not even a question, I'm obviously, someone spiked my drink, Damien. You know, you should also consider some extra things here, and I'm going to share those with you now. Before I have a heart attack. We need to make sure, you know, we've got the plan and everything as we've suggested, but we have to make sure that we comply with the assessment requirements of that relevant training product. And, you know, all the new ones have that information in there, and we need to make sure that we are covering off on that. Now, some of them will make some quite specific requirements around the assessment, that it has to be done on the job, for instance, or it has to be a certain amount of hours, or a particular type of client group, or multiple client groups, depending on the situation. So the one that springs to mind for me is some of the hairdressing units that specifically talk about different types of hair that needs to be used in different areas. So rather than just the same type of client, you need to be able to do this with multiple clients with different hair needs. We need to ensure that the principles of fairness, flexibility, validity, and reliability are adhered to. So in the end, we're checking whether or not, you know, we are doing things and asking the right kind of questions, and then in the end, we need to make sure that we're getting those right answers, and that's what the rules of evidence are all about. So we're asking ourselves through this validation process, have the tools that we've created and the resources that we have, do they produce valid, sufficient, authentic, and current evidence? So that becomes quite the linchpin of the validation process, and I'll talk more about that when we look at some of the templates as well. Some other considerations include this, you know, are they appropriate to the context or the conditions of the assessment? You know, invariably it's not a one-size-fits-all, and I know that sometimes having that universal assessment tool that everybody can do shows that, well, we're being consistent because we're asking the same question of everybody in the same way. But listen, that's not always relevant to that particular context or that learner group. And you might be creating barriers that have nothing to do with what you're trying to prove, and you're creating choices on how to design things for institutional reasons, not for client reasons or even training package reasons. So we need to be sure that it really is fit for the purpose. I had a conversation yesterday. I was working with a school, actually it's right next to our office at St Columban's College here in Queensland, and they were talking about how they contextualised their programs for school students, and their training and assessment strategy is just for school students, and of course that makes a lot of sense because they're a school, but they don't bring in teachers, for instance, to be students, because that would be wrong for that particular assessment tools, or wrong for the assessment tools that they've created. So it's sort of interesting to sort of look at some of that contextualization for that cohort. And, you know, there'll be some things that will be inappropriate in that environment and other things that will be appropriate in other environments. So some food for thought there. We also have to provide sufficient instructional guidance, and I cannot bang on more about this, okay? The more guidance we can give our assessors to make sure we get the consistency we need, the better everyone will be. And whether you call them an assessor guide or a marking guide or whatever beast it is, the devil is in the detail. We need to say, this is what we're looking for. This is what ideal answers look like. This is the kind of thing that the performance needs to have in it when you're looking at it. This is how you record that. These are some of the reasonable adjustments that are allowed. And the critical thing, folks, for us here moving forward is they have to be organic as well. So as something changes, you need to be able to update that advice within those assessor guides or marking guides, because what will happen is you'll have a cohort that's different from before, and if something happens, you go, well, that's okay. It's still in the spirit of the training package, but the guide doesn't allow for it. So we need to update the guide, because you can't know every single solution, but as you find credible ones, get them in the guide. So that means that assessors can let it in if it is indeed appropriate. Everyone's a winner when you've got that detail. And I guess that continues on to the next slide as well, because we get to outline those appropriate reasonable adjustments. So what is a reasonable adjustment? How does it work? What's allowable? What's in? And sometimes you might want to describe what's definitely not in. So this is what's not allowed for this particular situation, because it might be unclear. So again, I've been talking quite a bit on this particular topic, but I am interested in this question, the challenges that you presently face with validation with your own RTO. I highlighted this earlier in the introduction. Hopefully you've had a chance to ponder this, and please use the chat window to give me your craziest things that are turning your brain upside down around validation.
It'll be interesting to see the responses we get here, Mark. I remember that once before we ran a webinar on this topic, and I was really surprised by the variety of answers we got. Nathan's popped in with one of the all-time favourites to kick us off.
Yeah, it's definitely time, and Karen agrees. Karen agrees there with time, and I've mentioned this on previous webinars, Damien, that we're not just time poor, we're time destitute in this industry. So, yeah, some of the time savers I'm going to share with you a little bit later on in the webinar will get you on track. But in the end, you need to invest the time. It is an investment, but there's a definite impost on that time. So, and we're getting lots of time, And Annalise has got a really great comment there. Lack of structured time. So you might have time, but it's not being used as productively as it could be, and you might not have all the tools necessary. So that's why I wanted to give you so many tools as a result of our webinar today. Karen adds here, knowledgeable staff who value the process. What an awesome comment there, Karen. People just think it's about ticking boxes and doing it because the regulator requires it. I mean, that's as good as any reason to do it. But listen, I mentioned before the webinar started to some of you that were on the line at that moment that it just makes good business sense. Having a look at what we do and finding better ways to do it, or confirming that what we do meets the needs of everybody, we should be doing it anyway. I don't always understand why we sort of say, oh, I've got all this impost. I mean, it's the cost of doing business well, and that creates sustainability in itself, because if you're not doing these things, regardless of what business it is, something is going to fall over. So I guess in many ways, this kind of this extra oversight on what we do is going to be important. Yvette suggests here having a really large scope, and that is sort of tricky to make sure that everybody is on the same page there, particularly if you've got partners. So that adds to the risk there, Yvette, and I understand that definitely. And again, that the time to invest in systems and finding ways to collaborate is going to be very important. But ultimately, they're getting those systems where people have to agree to certain things even before they move on. And I'd even have some of these ideas within job descriptions, position statements, so that even new applicants know this is what we expect from somebody in this role. And even your trainers and assessors, it needs to be in there. That's part of it, because, let's face it, sometimes we can be divas and we think, no, I'm just a trainer. That's not my job. But yes, it is. It's part of the job. It's part of us in the vet sector. Yes, we value you as a subject matter expert and a capable facilitator, but we also need feedback about how your candidates are handling the instructions, how they're handling the work. Is it representative of what's out there in the field and so forth? So some really great comments there. Just a few other ones I'll take quickly there. People not understanding what it's all about, and even understanding things like reasonable adjustments. Annalise has added that. You know, having a lead person devoted to it, absolutely, Louise. That is it's a critical thing to have, but much harder in a smaller RTO, I've got to say, because you tend to be a jack of all trades. But of course, the challenge with that is that you kind of spread yourself a little thin, and that's what happens. Karen says there that again, people don't value the sustainability of this, so they're seeing short-term aims rather than the long-term benefit. So some really, really great ideas there, and I'll just close with this one from Yvette again. Inability to provide relevant professional development to the staff so they can take ownership of the process. So I couldn't agree more, Yvette, and getting that buy-in is such an important part of this, and sometimes that's a cultural issue that will take some time to move through. But listen, once you do it, Yvette, it really will change your RTO for the better. So I want to share with you the top 5 challenges that have been kind of shared widely through our industry, and many of these have been listed today in the chat box. So the ease of use tends to be a big thing. Like if it's a really complex, complicated, process, then that requires lots of, steps and lots of detail from individuals, then they won't do it. So we need plans that are easy to follow, templates that are easy to fill out, and people need to understand what their responsibilities and who they have to send that information to. There needs to be sufficient documentation. So you kind of, 1 and 2 kind of at opposite ends of the scale. So sometimes it's too complex, but sometimes it's not complex enough. So having sufficient documentation to not only back up that it happened, but also to give you those little gold nuggets that give you the actions to improve what you're doing is going to be important. We mentioned this in the chat box, the sustainability of the system. So is it something that has sufficient training, that people understand, they get the buy-in beforehand, and you've got someone who's responsible for it to keep the flame alive? Number 4 is the suitability of the validators. So we mentioned earlier there are 4 things that a validation group or an individual validator might need if they were, well, not might need, will need to be qualified. So we've got to make sure we've got the right people doing that. And finally, industry involvement. So we need that industry involvement to make sure that we do reflect that current practice. So I do want to share with you now the characteristics of our systematic assessment validation system, remembering that word systematic was a critical part in the standards for RTOs. It names it in there, so we have to show that it is indeed systematic and not just a list of things we hope to do. So actually, I really like the picture there. We want to be the orange fish in this particular case, leading our organisation into the clear waters. So the first thing we need to think about, folks, is it needs to be focused with a schedule of validation activities. I've given you a template today to get you started, but you need that schedule. Now, some people say, oh, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to do, in 5 years' time. I think there are a couple of milestones before you look at the 5th year. It's looking at that 50% by year 3, and then work your way back from that. And from our perspective, we do this annually. We have got a general plan over 5 years, but then we review it annually and make adjustments to that forward cast. So we do it over the 5 years mainly because we'll see that there are peaks and troughs historically in our business, and they make the most sense to kind of do some of these activities because we know we'll have personnel available. And then we look at our industry representatives to make sure we're not creating impost on them with their peak periods. So we've got that transparency, but things can change. So we review that towards the end of each year for the next year, and then we roll out the next year's schedule of validation. We do need someone who is responsible for it, okay? That doesn't mean that they're the only one that's doing it, but somebody needs to make sure that we're keeping on track with it, because one thing that a lot of RTOs do is they'll say that validation is everyone's responsibility, but if no one has it on their job description, in the end it becomes nobody's responsibility, and you're pushing the buck. I thought you were doing it, I thought you were doing it, I thought you were doing it, and then no one's doing it. So someone has to be responsible. There needs to be systems to support it. So it's great to have a plan, but do you have those actionable things that can happen thereafter? You know, is there a particular template to use? Do you load it up into a cloud-based situation? Are you expecting there to be video or audio to be recorded? Is somebody going to put that into an LMS? However it works, you need the system, and everybody needs to know what it's all about. Serena's actually asked a quick question I'll pause on quickly there, which is, anyone else get tied up with the ASQA calculator percentages, and do we have to adhere to this? Well, it's really interesting, Serena, because the ASQA had what I thought was a pretty good calculator, and now they've removed that from their site. And it sort of push you out to other sort of statistical measures to make it work. I mean, ultimately, from my perspective, this is an example of a system. You need to know, well, what do we think is statistically significant when it comes to sampling the work, and what's going to give us a good reflection of the cohort that we're looking at. And invariably, if you've only got a small amount of students, let's say you've got 100 students, well, you know, you probably need to look at 20, 30, 40% of those to really get a feel for whether this is working. Whereas if you had 1,000 students, you might not need much more to get a statistically significant sample. To try to give you some guidance, Serena, I think the key thing to look at here is defendability. So if you come up with a strategy or a system for it, can you defend that? To say, well, this is how we've chosen to come up with the sample size. We've used this particular calculator or this particular industry calculation, whatever it is. Put it into your TAS as part of your validation approach, and you know, in the end, it's up for somebody else to say that you're wrong. But as long as it's defendable, and I think it gives you that, as I said, statistically significant sample size, then I think you'd be okay. The next step in making it sustainable is having those activities and actions documented. So we could do all the really good groundwork, but then we don't document anything, which means we can't prove that it happened, and we don't have the most accurate and credible information to make those decisions down the track. The final point I wanted to make here, I think it's the most important of the set, we need to look at validation as being part of business, not apart from the business. And I mentioned this before. You know, it's a part of business, not apart from the business. Let's look at how we can make this part of what we do on a regular basis, so that way it's not like something we're just trying to do once for every 5 years. It is something that sort of is in our DNA, it's who we are. And I think if you approach it that way, life will definitely be easier. So we're about 2/3 of the way through our webinar at this stage, folks. I did want to give you your 30 seconds of Zen. We do like to do a stretch break at this particular point, just to make sure that we've got enough energy for the homeward bound trip on at the end of the webinar. So I'll give you 30 seconds. Grab a drink of water, do a stretch, and we'll see you back in a sec.
Okay, so Mark's taking his stretch break, and I'm sure that you're working this pose today, Mark. It works the glutes. Just think how good it is for the glutes as you do it. And ladies and gentlemen, do not hesitate to adopt that same pose as well. It's good for your body. Makes you feel good as well.
Yeah, I'm feeling that deep burn, Damien. So I'm good.
Great.
As always, we should say, as long as it's safe. You know, as long as it's safe and you've got enough space to do it. So hopefully you've got a stretch. Liz wish she could do that one, but listen, with effort and practice, you too can stretch like this. I'm not sure that there's enough years left in my lifespan to get that good, but I'll give it a go nonetheless.
Chris is showing off a little bit there in the chat. He spent his whole webinar like that. So, Chris, I'm very impressed. Well done.
Well done, Chris. And listen, my next challenge for you is to do the rest of the webinar as a plank. Okay, so if we can do that, that will be awesome. So we're back after our break, folks, and I've got this question for you. What are you presently using to support your validation activities, if anything? What sorts of techniques, templates, tools, external, third-party? What is it that you're using to make it work? I mean, there's more than one right answer to this particular one there, but it's sort of interesting with such a large group today to kind of get a sense for what's going on.
I like this question, Mark, and the reason I like it is it comes back to one of the questions you asked earlier about what holds us back from validation activities, and there was a couple of people who basically hinted that it was the systems and support, and let's flesh that out a little bit and see if we can get some good responses here to help us.
Yeah, Karen says that's what she's here for, and hopefully get a few ideas. So maybe we're looking for some other ideas, which is good. So if anybody's got some super ideas, feel free to pop them on the chat window. And keep them coming too, guys. If you're still thinking about that one, that's great. You know, Liz has suggested here templates that maybe need improving, so looking at them more frequently. I was at a meeting recently, and it was funny. They were sort of talking to me, and then they were almost embarrassed, saying, "Oh, listen, we haven't updated these templates for a while," and they were quite old. And it's like, well, you know, you shouldn't be waiting for me to look at them for you to say we needed to do something about this. But it's like anything else. You know, it's a bit like when you bring people to your house, you all of a sudden want to clean up everything, but you're happy to live in that filth yourself. You know, it's kind of funny. And RTO is a bit like that too, isn't it? So the validation is not about hiding the things. It's a matter of saying, let's look at it. How do we make it better, more productive, more efficient? And Annalise has added, yeah, there's some great stuff that VELG Training do on this one, the template. So, you know, if you're not already a member, listen, it's really worth the spend, because they've got a really great resource list there and things that can really help you in this particular space. And Serena adds this too, is that their choice. So it's a really great industry representatives they've got on staff there too, and their contractors are some of the best, I think, in the country. So definitely some good ideas. But Serena likes mine too, which is good. I like that. But we also do work with VELG too, so I'll put myself under that same category if you don't mind. So I will share with you now some technology options, and you know, again, remember the smorgasbord that I was telling you about. Take them or leave them, but these are some things that RTOs out there now are using to support this process. Now, the first one I wanted to share is an Australian-based one, which is called HipChat, and this is sort of on the back of Atlassian, that are a big sort of cloud computing group here in Australia, and one of the consistent best places to work, so they kind of know what they're doing. But this is a really great way for you to collaborate and share files. You can do video chats, you can do private chats, all sorts of integrations there too. In fact, they've got integrations with things like MailChimp and other things you might be using. Definitely worth a look at. They do have a free version. If you've got a sort of a reasonably small group there, then you won't ever need to go past the free version. Of course, if you're a bigger organisation and you think it's working for you, they've got some pricing plans you can check out. But generally speaking, I find the free one to be quite useful for the size groups you would normally have to do validation. So I'd be checking that out as an option. The one that we use on a regular basis is Basecamp. It's a project management situation, and I love it. I love it because of all the connectivity I've got with all my devices. So I can check it on my phone, on my tablet, on my computer, desktop. I can share files very easily. I can tell people what the dates are. They go to our calendars. It's, you know, I think it's fabulous. And when we think about validation, it very much is a project plan, and having some tool to enable us to get that together, get that transparency will be great. And again, you can assign someone the project manager, which goes back to one of those key things for sustainability, which is having someone responsible for it. If you want a different option, and a lot of organisations are using this in preference to Basecamp, Asana is also quite good. It has much the same sort of functionality as Basecamp. It has a very similar navigation bar as well. So if you've used Basecamp before and you're looking for something a little different and in the end potentially cheaper, Asana might be an option for you as well. Another particular situation you might want to use is Makaigo. I love this one because it's a really simple screen sharing situation, and in the end what it allows you to do is connect people from multiple places and share some of the information that you're looking to do. So I actually find this one quite useful for validation activities when you're bringing a small group together and you can get them all there on the same time. A bit like what we're achieving here today with this webinar, but again, the free option is actually very, very good. It has lots of features that I think will be sufficient for the processes that we want to use. If you want something super simple, today's meet might get you over the line. This is a text-based situation, and how this works is you go to today's meet, you come up with a room name, you work out how long you want people to be able to collaborate in that room, you give them the link, and only those people with the link can get on and collaborate and share ideas and so forth. In the end, you can cut and paste it all into a document, and then you've got it all there. It doesn't have to be done live either, so people can come in whenever they like into the room and make a comment on a particular assessment tool and whatnot, and then other people can go in and you can kind of curate those comments, which is kind of cool. So again, something for us to be thinking about down the track. And then if you're looking for a way just to manage access to a whole bunch of really large files, I think Dropbox is a really good option for that. You know, a lot of the things that we'll use in our RTO space are much bigger than what we can send on an email. The cool thing about Dropbox too is that everybody that's been included on the folder can also have little notes that you can put in different sections of the document. So this is also really good to, again, capture some of those notes. They're kind of like virtual sticky notes. So again, I love the functionality between multiple devices as well for this, and that works well for me. If you want to make it even simpler, folks, a schedule validation meetings across your existing calendars. So things like iCal or Outlook, put them in advance. You've got the reminders. If you think you need multiple reminders, then put multiple reminders in. What I like about this approach, folks, is that it's really audit friendly, because you know, somebody can come in and say, well, show us when you did these things, and you can go into your Outlook, you can show what happened, who you spoke to, who was invited, and then my recommendation there would be to add some other comments as a result of what you talked about, which makes it even more you know, effective. And then finally here, you might want to think about an email panel. And it's almost old school technology now, the old email, but sometimes people feel more comfortable getting the document, thinking about it, and then replying via the same. And if you wanted a variation between that, what you might do is have the email panel, which kind of says this is what we're expecting on this particular occasion, and then click here to maybe a Google Doc, and that way all of the email panel members can still write comments on the same document. So that might be a way of collectively using that technology. Remember that all of what we're sharing today you'll get as an example. So all the web links to all of these you'll have access to with the slides. And again, I've just got a very quick summary on this particular slide of all the things we've just talked about. I won't run past them again, but you will have that on those copies of the slides if you want to check them out a little bit later. So are there any other technology solutions you've seen used to support validation activities? I see there that Evernote or OneNote are also good. Louise has suggested that. So that's an alternate sort of cloud-based situation. I also really like Evernote because of the way that you can share that and it syncs in real time. So again, you could be at the coffee club having your validation meeting, and then you can load up the stuff from your tablet, and then when you get back to the office, it's there looking at you as well. So definitely some cool ideas there from Louise. And as I said, if you've got any other ideas on that, feel free to pop in the chat box and we'll double back around on them before we finish up today. Oh, Damien's just added their Slack for team collaboration. So we've just sort of been trialling Slack at Mr. Wed and found some really positive ways for people to teleconference quite effectively. So bringing multiple people on at the same time using the single app. So some great ideas there. And Liz adds Blackboard Collaborate meetings, again using almost a webinar type platform to be able to bring people together and share ideas. The great thing about that, as well as things like GoToMeeting or GoToTraining that we're using today, is you've got the chat logs, so you've got evidence that it actually happened, which I think is entirely good. But maybe you might want to think about some outsourcing options. And as the picture says, you don't have to do everything yourself. Even Batman had Robin. And again, I just wanted you to think about this and take it or leave it as always. You might want to think about using virtual assistants to organise some of the industry engagement or validation activities. This could be cost-effective and a time-efficient solution. There are many options, and I wanted to give you 4 today, just so that you've got something to investigate after today. So what these do is they're all Australian organisations who use offshore workers to do the work that we want them to do, and some of them will use things like Basecamp to manage those works. Others will have sort of a project situation where you buy a certain amount of hours for a particular project. Some you'll buy 20 hours, 40 hours per month because that's the level of work that's required. Again, you've got to be comfortable with it, but listen, I think there are some different options out there for you to consider. For the record, we use the guys at Boss Tech, and we like them because they've got a dream team. And what that means is we buy a block of 40 hours, and then we can use that 40 hours between any of the particular consultants that they've got available. We do pay a little more per hour for that privilege, but I find that we're not necessarily wasting our hours, because I might only need someone for 5 hours to do something. And we use them a lot for cleaning up databases and doing graphic art and editing, post-production video things. But again, they've got workers there that can also be ringing people, checking to make sure that they're coming to certain events and so forth. So worth having a look at, and in the end, make your own choice about what's going to work for your organisation. In terms of some other popular approaches that are out there, team, pilots and trials, which really gives you a chance to analyse student feedback and compare the tools, evidence and judgments to a standard before you sort of roll it out to a full fee-paying student. Big fan of the pilot and really worth looking at. We've talked already about sampling, and having a defendable sample size or a strategy for determining that sample size will be important. I'm a huge fan of the validation panel, either internally or externally, and in the end, I think there's some really great ways for us to stay connected with our industry representatives this way. And for me, it's about changing the narrative a bit about trying to get their participation, and rather going cap in hand and saying, please sir, can you sit on our panel? It's more about saying, listen, we've selected you because we think that you're a great industry representative, and you've got an opportunity now to make a contribution to affecting change in this space. And my other advice here is to be very upfront about what somebody's commitment's going to be for that validation panel. So you might say, we meet once a year, and it's going to be for a couple of hours, and you're going to have to fill out a report. Or it is, we meet every quarter, and we're going to pay for your travel, but we're not going to pay for you to be there for that particular time. So however it is, they need to know what it is up front, and not even have a job description for the validator too, so they knew exactly what it is that they're expected to do. The final one here is a lead assessor to ensure the consistency of judgments, and that way you've got someone that's really on your side, making sure that everything's being done in the way that it's intended. And particularly in a large organisation, or an organisation we've got multiple partners, you've got someone there to kind of keep them accountable for those standards or those systems you've put in place. Some templates you might want to use down the track might be having a look at a validation approaches grid and choosing the right tool for the right job at the right time. You have an example of that in our courseware today. You might have a range of validation templates, and in the downloadables and the stuff that you'll be able to download later from the link, I've got a validation template which is a basic one, as well as the validation report, which is a lot more complex, together with the validation schedule that we've already looked at. So this is, the picture's not super great on the screen, but this is a quick snap at what the grid looks like. And when that comes up on the screen, you'll see that there are validation approaches, and they've got the kind of the pros and the cons. But on the right-hand side, it tells you what this particular approach is best to capture. So if you're trying to zero in on judgments or processes or the actual tools themselves, you can again choose the right tool for the job. So this is just the first page, but there's multiple pages here and some tools in the kit bag. And then you've got the template there. This is a sort of a basic validation template will look like that. And I've also got a more elaborate one there, which is the validation report. So I really wanted to give you some choice to make sure that you've got something to put in the practice later. And then the final one there is a sort of an example there. You'll get the blank version of this, which is how you might validate those assessment tools. So very specifically looking at the kinds of things that we might want in that report, that final report. So I've got some info on that, and you'll see here quite specifically we want to make sure we're looking at those principles of assessment and the rules of evidence to make sure our stuff's doing what it needs to do. So just in summary, I guess there, folks, of those, we need to make sure that it's assessing what it claims to assess. It's likely to produce a consistent result. That's what reliability is all about. Does it draw from a range of methods, which means it's flexible to context and cohorts? And is it fair for the students? Individuals, learners' needs catered for within that particular setting. From the rules of evidence perspective, do we know that it's really their work? Can the assessor be confident the learners can do those things? Is the instrument something that is their own work? Does it meet the standard? Can we be assured that the assessment evidence demonstrates their current competency? They might have done it 10 years ago, but can they do it today? And is there enough of it? Okay. So ultimately, they're the 8 pillars that help us to judge whether or not our tools are okay, and it will help us to see whether the right judgments were made according to those particular things. I've got all the links to everything we've got today, so all the information I'm sharing from the regulator is in the ASQA fact sheet. You've got the link there, remembering you'll get a copy of this so you can check it out later, and also the key information from the standards for RTOs is also there, and those key technology options I shared, you've got the URLs there on that page as well. And the final thing, folks, is that I do have a light paper. It's like a white paper, but just shorter, and it's about developing that system of sustainable assessment validation. There's a few pages there, but really it's a chance to extend what we've talked about today, and it gives you your blueprint for success in implementing what we're talking about today. So today we've talked about what validation is, what the regulator says, some of our present challenges. I've zeroed in on the characteristics of that systematic validation system, shared with you some technology to help you along on the process, and then loaded you up with a whole bunch of templates and tools to get you started on that journey for success. So in the end, folks, at the where to from here, I said we've got the candy bar. I wanted you to pick something sweet. If you can just quickly share what that might be, what's your next move from here, what's your piece of candy that's going to get you in the right space, feel free to pop that in the chat window now. And I know that we've hit our final time, but I'm happy to take any final questions at this particular stage as well. So if you want to take a moment there to reflect upon what's your key takeaway, as well as if you need to ask any other questions, feel free to do that now. Whilst you're considering that, I'll just remind us about our next webinar that's coming up. This is a super webinar, folks. It's not compliance, I get that, but if you want to make your PowerPoint slides more effective, more powerful, and in the end, more effective, check out this one next month, run by yours truly. So with that, folks, I'm happy to look at what's going on there. Damien, anything else to add? Have I missed any questions there?
Mark, you haven't missed any questions that I can see. I think we're just about the finish line. I really wanted to thank everyone for your participation, for all the kind comments you're making at the moment. If you do have a key takeaway, please don't hesitate to pop it in the chat there. And thank you, Mark, for I think it's been a very interesting webinar.
Thanks, Damien, and for those that don't have a question now but might come up with one later, there's all my details. Feel free to email me later or tweet it out in 140 characters or less if that's an easier way to communicate with me. In any case, folks, hope to see you on another webinar soon. Thanks so much. Have an awesome weekend. And Damien, as always, thanks for producing a great webinar, and we'll see you next time.
My pleasure, Mark. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.